Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. Welcome to our home. This is where we do our midweek Torah study. We have started these in the last 6 months or so, and it's been a nice forum for us. So what I do is I upload a video of the Torah portion and the study, and we're working our way through towards the end of Bereshit, the end of Genesis, and getting ready to go into Shemot, Exodus. If you have any comments, if you have any contribution, you will find my email address in the comments below, and you will find a place for your comments directly to this video. You're welcome to reach out and engage in discussion of any kind. Likewise, if you'd like to be on notice when we publish these videos, then you could subscribe to our channel and you will get notice of our videos as they publish. Likewise, if you are in Fort Myers and you would like to join us for our services, yes, we are in services. We do have face-to-face services, in-person services, as you will. We have plenty of room for social distancing. The room is definitely not full, and you would be welcome to join us at any time. If you have any questions, give us a call, and we can discuss that. But if you want to continue to follow us online, all of our Shabbat services are live streamed as well, so you can join us for live stream services. They are posted Shabbat, Saturday morning at 11 a.m., but you can join us at any time after those are published. Okay, without further ado, I might be remiss to not thank you for those of you who support this ministry. I know that many of you do, and I'm very, very grateful for that, and we do depend on your support. So moving forward, 2021 is going to be an uncertain year, but that's okay because our Adonai, our God, is not uncertain. He is certain, and He fills us with His assurances. So we have great hope and great confidence in that for the year to come. If you would like to support this ministry, you will find a link in the description below that you can click on. It redirects you to Easy Tithe, which is our portal to receive your tithes and gifts and love offerings. But I do know that many of you do support us, so for that I'm very grateful. So thank you. All right, let's begin. This week's Torah portion, Vayigash, he approached from Bereshit, Genesis chapter 44, verse 18 through chapter 47, verse 27. We begin with a summary. I borrow these summaries sometimes from Or Samech, which you can find online. They do a nice little summary, so if you recognize any of this, credit where credit is due. I do borrow this from Or Samech. So, the summary for this week's Parsha. When the brothers left Joseph for the second time, they were rounded up by some of Joseph's servants, and the sacks were undone, and they found the cup, the silver cup, in Benjamin's sack. And the brothers are in confusion and disarray. Judah steps forward and eloquently but firmly petitions Joseph for Benjamin's release, offering himself in place of, instead of Benjamin. As a result of this single statement, the single act, which we talked about at great length, Joseph finally is convinced that the family is ready to move forward, and he reveals himself to the brothers. So he reveals himself as their brother Joseph. The brothers are alarmed at this and ashamed, but Joseph consoles them and encourages them, telling them that everything has been part of Adonai's plan. He sends them back to their father Jacob, Yaakov, with a message to come and live in the land of Egypt. At first, Jacob cannot accept the news, but when he recognizes the message positively identifying Joseph, his spirit is revived, and together with all his family and all his possessions, they set out for Egypt. Adonai, excuse me, Adonai meets with Jacob along the way and gives him a vision, and it's a last vision, and we'll talk about that today. Tells him not to be afraid of going down to Egypt. tells him not to be afraid of the negative consequences of Egypt, because it is there that Adonai will establish the children of Israel as a great nation, even though they will be dwelling in a land steeped in immorality and corruption and in sin. The Torah lists Jacob's offspring and hints to the birth of Yocheved, who would be the mother of Moses. 70 people in all descend into Egypt, where Joseph is reunited with his father after 22 years of separation. He embraces his father and weeps, overflowing with joy. Joseph secures the settlement of his family in Goshen, and Joseph takes his father Jacob and 5 of the least of his brothers to be presented to Pharaoh, and Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Joseph instructs that in return for grain, all the people of Egypt must give everything to Pharaoh, including themselves as his slaves. Joseph then redistributes the population except for the Egyptian priests, who are directly supported by the Pharaoh. The children of Jacob, of Israel, become settled, and they multiply greatly. That's the summary of this week's Torah portion. You can find numerous Torah summaries online. Recommend you consider one. Just it helps you jumpstart your Torah study, so I always recommend that, and so forth. One of the questions I wanted to bring up this week is Benjamin, just a discussion of Benjamin. Benjamin is a favored son, but he's a second favored son of Jacob, because he's the second son of Jacob's favored wife, Rachel. With the loss of Joseph, Benjamin is set to inherit the preferred portion. He's set to inherit the preferred position in his father's eyes. In fact, you could even argue that Benjamin is set to be the Bechor. He is set up for that position because of Jacob's obvious preference for Rachel and the children of Rachel. It's obvious that Benjamin is favored of Jacob and protected of Jacob. This should set Benjamin well in the line of succession, that in some capacity or some expression, Benjamin is going to be the Bechor. What I want to do is I want to compare Judah and Benjamin with David and Jonathan. And so now some of you know where I'm going, and you can jump ahead if you like. So Benjamin has, in our Parsha today, Benjamin has been framed by Joseph, but Judah doesn't know this. For all that Judah knows, Benjamin has indeed stolen the silver cup. For all that Judah knows, Benjamin thought he had an opportunity and went ahead and grabbed the cup. And for all Judah knows, this is a tragedy in that Benjamin has done this terrible thing. Okay. Joseph says he's going to take Benjamin as a slave. He doesn't have to die. He's not going to die. He's just going to be a slave in Joseph's house. This is a test. Judah and the brothers sold Joseph into slavery, and now they can get rid of Benjamin as a slave. See, do you see the comparison? It is Joseph offering to take Benjamin as a slave in the same way that Joseph himself was a slave. When the brothers got rid of Joseph, it was opportune. They sold him into slavery. It was an opportunistic moment. They said, look at the traders. There's some traders over there. Let's sell our brother into slavery rather than putting him to death. And so that's what they did. And here we have another opportune moment. What can they tell their father other than, it appears, Benjamin tried to steal the cup. He got caught. And now he's a slave in this viceroy's house. And so forth. Now, you might respond and say, okay, yeah, but Jacob's going to be distraught. What about Jacob is going to be crushed. Well, the brothers are going to take over for their father anyway. The brothers are going to live in the land of Canaan, presumably, if they don't come to Egypt. The brothers would continue to live in the land of Canaan. The children of Rachel would be no more. Both of the children of Rachel are now in Egypt, and the other brothers, the 10 other brothers, can go on with their business and their lives in Canaan, in Canaan. Instead of all this, see, what I'm trying to do is paint for you the picture that was a viable scenario. Yeah, Jacob would have been distraught, but he mistreated all the 10 sons. He treated them terribly growing up. And so he played favorites, and that's the worst thing you can do to a child is play favorites. And so they might be justified. What I want to do is see how convenient Joseph made it for the brothers to walk away from Benjamin. Instead of all this, Judah appeals to Joseph. Judah steps in, and I want you to see the magnitude of that moment that Judah steps in. Chapter 44. Judah is representing and telling the story of their family in order to make an appeal for the release of Benjamin. And so he's telling the story of the family, and in telling the story of the family, Judah is going to acknowledge many, many things about their family, many dysfunctions, many things that are unfair and wrong that go on in their family. Judah is going to acknowledge all these things in this long dialogue that he has telling the story of their family. And then in verse 7, Judah says this, Then your servant, my father, said to us, You yourselves know that my wife bore me 2 sons. What is being said here? Jacob is telling the sons, You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. How many wives? 1 wife. Which wife? Rachel. How many sons? 2 sons. Which sons? Joseph and Benjamin. This is the favored wife and the favored sons. Judah is acknowledging, wait a minute, how could Judah say this? What about Leah and Leah's sons? And what about Zilpah and Bilhah, the 4 sons of the concubines? Do you see what Judah's doing here? He's pointing out to the viceroy, whom he doesn't know as Joseph, he's pointing out to the viceroy how incredibly dysfunctional this scenario is. Verse 29, If you also take this one away from before me, and an accident happens to him, you will bring my gray hair down to the evil of Sheol. Judah is telling the story of what Jacob said. I will die. If something happens to Benjamin, I will die. Look at this in verse 30. It says, Now if I come to your servant my father, and the boy isn't with us. This is Judah speaking to Joseph. If I come to your servant, if I go back to my father, if I go back to Jacob, and Benjamin isn't with me, since his life is bound to his life. It says that in the text I'm reading from the Tree of Life version. Since his life is bound to his life, life bound to life. Verse 31, When he sees that the boy is no more, he'll die. Then your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in grief. For your servant, that's me, Judah, became a pledge for the boy with my father, saying, If I don't bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before my father all my days. Verse 33, So now please let your servant remain. This is Judah speaking to Joseph, saying, Please let Judah, myself, remain as my lord's slave in the boy's place, in Benjamin's place, and let the boy go up with his brothers. For how can I go up to my father, verse 34, and the boy is not with me? Else I must see the evil that would come upon my father. All right. A couple things are happening here that I want to point out to you. When Abraham came down from the mountain, and he was supposed to go up on the mountain and sacrifice Isaac, and he came to the point where he was bound on the wood. Isaac was bound on the wood, and Abraham had the knife in his hand, and the messenger of Adonai stayed his hand. And Isaac was spared in that last moment, but for all intents and purposes, Isaac was to be the sacrifice. And then we come down off the mountain, and we have a hint of sort of a PTSD moment between Isaac, Abraham, and Sarah. And we find the 3 of these are now living in separate places after that one incident. They live in separate places. In fact, shortly after this, Sarah dies, and shortly after this, Abraham comes to mourn Sarah and to bury her. All right. What I want you to do is compare the hypothetical of Judah and the brothers returning without Benjamin, and the hypothetical Abraham returning without Isaac. Do you see what's happening there? Abraham was prepared to return without Isaac as an expression of the sacrifice, as an expression of obedience here. And we have kind of a contrast in that Judah is unwilling to return without Benjamin. Do you see what's happening here? But the point that I want to make is we have the same sort of emotional PTSD moment of the trauma of nearly losing a child. If your child nearly drowns, you don't want to go back to the same beach again, right? You don't want to go back there. It's a terrible place now. If you've been in a car accident, a horrific car accident, you don't want to drive that same road, or you don't want to drive in that same car, or you don't want to drive, period. It's a kind of PTSD moment. And what I'm submitting to you is that there is a PTSD moment that is kind of an echo going back to the Abraham coming down off the mountain with Isaac. All right. So Judah is not willing to have that. And so Judah says, now let your servant remain. Let Judah remain as a slave in the boy's place, in Benjamin's place. Let the Benjamin go up with his brothers, verse 33. And for that moment, in that moment, is when Joseph turns and reveals himself. But let's talk about this. Let me back up a little bit here. So one of the things that we have with Jacob is Jacob does a lot of weeping. Sorry, this is true. Jacob weeps when he meets Rachel for the first time. And we have this idea of weeping in this place, right? And then we have this in Jeremiah 31. We have this. This is Adonai, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Ramah is the site also of Bethlehem. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Rachel is weeping for them. And so we have this idea of weeping in context with losing the children of Rachel. Well, what does it mean to lose the children of Rachel? It is that they're gone. And of course, in Matthew, we have this expression that this was fulfilled in the little boys who gave up their life after the birth of Yeshua at the hands of Herod, the evil one, the wicked one who killed the little boys in Bethlehem. Verse 45, or chapter 45, Bereshit, Genesis chapter 45, verse 1. Joseph could no longer restrain himself in front of all those who were standing by him, so he cried out, "Get everyone away from me." No one stood with him, and Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. Verse 2, but he gave his voice to weeping, so that the Egyptians heard. When can you hear somebody weeping? When they're wailing, when they're loud, when they're vocal. They were in the different room or in a different part of the house, and they heard it. And Pharaoh's household heard. It was so loud and such a tumult that everybody heard this. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" He revealed himself, and his brothers weren't able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Verse 14, look at this. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. This is Joseph once again. Joseph weeping again. He wept upon his neck. And Benjamin wept upon his neck. And then he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And finally, after all this, his brothers finally talked to him. So let me point out to you what's happening here. In verse 14, he fell upon his brother's Benjamin's neck, and he wept. So this is Joseph weeping on Benjamin's neck. And then we've got Benjamin wept upon Joseph's neck. There's a lot of weeping going on. You've got Jacob weeping, you've got Rachel weeping, and now you've got Joseph and Benjamin weeping. All right. Let's go back to chapter 44, verse 30, if we can, please, and look at this. His life is bound to his life. So, Ve'ata kevoi el avdecha. This is the Hebrew in chapter 44, verse 3. Ve'ata kevoi el avdecha avi ve'hana'ar enenu itanu. And then we have this. Venafsho kashura venafsho. Now if I come to your servant my father, and the boy isn't with us, since his life is bound to his life, is what it's saying. And what I want you to do is look also at the Hebrew in this. His life is nefesh in the Hebrew, which is venafsho here in the text here, but the root of it is nefesh. All right. Also consider the narrative in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 56. So the king says, then find out whose son the young man is. This is in the narrative immediately following the killing of Goliath by David. Verse 56, find out whose son this young man is. Well, see, what's happening here is that Saul is speaking, and he's inquiring about David. This is after David has killed the Philistine. And you might say, oh, well, of course he would. He would want to find out who this David is. But he already knew David. David was a harpist in his court. David was the one who brought peace to him. So where does this come from? Saul would have already have known David at this point. Find out whose son the young man is. When David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of Philistine in his hand. And Saul asks him, verse 58, whose son are you, young man? David answers, I'm the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And then we skip ahead to chapter 18, verse 1. Now it came to pass, when David had finished speaking to Saul, Jonathan's soul was knit to David's soul, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan cut a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan cut a covenant that day with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped off the robe that was on him and gave it to David. Where have we heard of that before? There was a special robe that was on that was on Joseph. Joseph being of Rachel. There was a special coat that was on Rachel. It was stripped off by Judah, right? It was stripped off by Judah. And in this case, Jonathan is stripping off his robe and giving it to David. Jonathan of the tribe of Benjamin, David of the tribe of Judah, along with his armor, his sword, his bow, and his belt. All right, so this is what we have. Venefesh Yehonatan Nikshera benefesh David. The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. Vaye ehavo, vaye ehavahu, Yehonatan kenafsho. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. I know my Hebrew pronunciation isn't very good, so if there's any scholars in the audience, you have my deep apologies. The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Where does this come from? Judah gives up his life for Benjamin, and here Benjamin, in the form of Jonathan, gives up his right to the throne to Judah, to David. Jonathan gave up his coat. Their souls were knit to each other. The point that I want to make with this is that Judah's soul was knit to Benjamin's when Judah chose, first of all, to step into his place, but also to acknowledge the dysfunction that was in the family, the favoritism that was in the family, the injustice that was in the family. Judah overlooked that justice and actually became an advocate for the father in spite of the father's injustice. All right. So here we have Judah giving up his life for Benjamin, and Benjamin giving up his right to the throne to Judah through David and Jonathan. Their souls were knit to each other. I've spoken about this a great deal on Shabbat services and then in some of these teachings. This is the bottom line. This is the teaching, is that it is Jew and Gentile knit together, and that the Gentile in the kingdom of God needs to understand that Judah is stepping forward in the form of Messianic Jews are stepping forward to be the leader, to be the Bechor of the family in every sense of the word, which means to be the leader and the teacher, but also means to be a sacrifice. All right. But we've spoken at this at great length. So let's move on a little bit here and see if we can't finish up in the next few minutes. The other item I want to bring to your attention, and this is something that has kind of poked my interest this year, and that is that we have this appearance of Adonai to Jacob in this parsha. There's this kind of like, you would almost wonder why it's there. Jacob ought to be in a hurry to go down to see Joseph and see him. Remember that Abraham went down to Egypt. Isaac was going to go down to Egypt. We've got this thing with Egypt amongst our people. And so Jacob is on his way to Egypt, and this is after he returned to the land from the land of Haran, of his fathers. And so it's almost as if Jacob finally comes into the land, and then now he's going to leave the land, and here he's getting quite old. And so we have this, they're on their way, they're making their way to Egypt for the reunion between Jacob and Joseph. And we have this where Jacob stops to make sacrifices. Verse 46, Israel set out along with everything that belonged to him. When he came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. In visions of the night, God said to Israel, Jacob, Jacob. A couple things here. In a couple passages earlier, Jacob refers to Adonai as God, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac. And here it says he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. And what I believe is happening here is that the idea of who Isaac thought Adonai was and who Jacob thought Adonai was is coming together and being reconciled and resolved here on the eve of going down into Egypt, which is necessary that it be that. In the visions of the night, Adonai said to Israel, Jacob, Jacob, Hineni, that means here I am, he said in the Hebrew. Verse 3, I am God, the God of your father. He said, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will turn you into a great nation there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt. I myself will almost certainly bring you up. And Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. And so here we have this kind of insertion here, almost in the middle of nowhere. What I want to bring to your attention is that, and I'll be speaking about this in future Parsha discussions as well, that let me just introduce it here, and that is that Adonai went silent with the people of Israel. This is the last appearance of Adonai before Moses. And we really do have a sense in which there is no real interaction. I mean, but Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all had interactions with Adonai. They had prophetic and profound and powerful spiritual interactions with Adonai. And now it's like we're getting into the silent years. And there's going to be a lot of silence in the people of Jacob here, as far as in their dialogue and discussion with Adonai. The other thing that I want to do is I want to touch on the blessing here, and that is that it says Joseph will put his hands on your eyes, meaning that Jacob would pass in peace, surrounded by his sons, all his sons, including his most beloved son, which would be Joseph. It is the blessing of passing into the rest. It is that his hands are going to close your eyes and you will drift into eternity. In the same way, Jacob would be passing into the silence of rest in Adonai. It is the blessing of passing into rest. I myself will go down with you, says Adonai. I myself will bring you up. They can't possibly know Adonai's plan, and he doesn't have a plan for them at this time. But what he does have is the assurance of this promise that he will bring them up. They have his assurance that he will do this. It took 210 years, but they had his assurance that he will do this, and he did do this. But it was through such incredible horror and difficulty. Remember the vision of Abraham with the parts, the covenant of the parts, when it was filled with terror and great darkness, and it was the idea of it being like something unholy and evil and dark and sorrowful. That was going to be the experience of Israel when they went into Egypt. And of course, it doesn't take us long, and we're right there. I'm going to conclude it there, just in the fullness of assurance that Adonai will continue this story. I'm going to conclude there, and we will continue to post these Torah studies. Please let me know any comments that you might have, any discussion that you would like to have. And once again, I am just very grateful to do this with you. Please reach out to me with any questions or thoughts that you might have. In the meantime, may Adonai go with you and give you a good week, a week of peace. Blessings and shalom.